Good morning. You were here to talk about liberty, yes, for the rest of the week in economics. We're going to talk a little bit about old-fashioned liberty. Old-fashioned is an ancient Greek liberty. The very first talk today will be on Plato. A little bit later on, we'll be reading from Plato's Republic. A little bit later on today, after that, we'll be reading from Thucydides, the historian of the Peloponnesian War, sort of giving us a, how should we say, a different perspective on what happens to people once they have freedom, what you do with freedom and liberty. Before I get started any further, you've noticed past news events for the last week have been pretty much wrapped around the whole crisis in Washington, D.C., yes? An often forgotten topic in this rather haggard time is what's happening in the Middle East right now, which was all in the news for the last spring. Most notably, what's happening in the nation of Syria. I'm from the Philippines originally, so sort of, political strife is a repeated theme in my rather errant past, very, very long time ago. What's happening in Syria is a very stark story of a people trying very, very hard to gain something for themselves and having a government fight very, very hard not to give these people that thing they want. I wanted to ask you guys, if you obviously keep up with the news on that, what exactly are the people in Syria, and if you sort of extrapolate further, early on in the spring, people in Egypt, people in Libya, what are they sort of doing what they're doing for? What is the point to marching out in the street knowing you're kind of taking your life into your own hands doing so? What do you seek to gain? There's risk involved, obviously, but what's the reward? Why do you think this would be important for the people in the Middle East to do so? Very good. Let's look at one case in particular. We don't know what's exactly going to happen with Syria, but let's look at Egypt for a second. Egypt's an interesting story where you depose a dictator who's been there for many years, yes, Mr. Mubarak. But oddly enough, when the people who deposed Mr. Mubarak are in the throes of enjoying what they've now won, one of the more interesting stories happened that happened right after the liberation, if you say, of Cairo, is a group of people turned their attention and harassed, assaulted a Western reporter, a female Western reporter, which leads one to scratch one's head and say, if one is trying very hard to gain freedom, why does the freedom one gains, why is it now geared towards or focused to something that can be described perhaps as less than free? Can freedom corrupt? Is it a virtue? Arguably, yes. But what happens once it is gained? How sometimes does it turn to something worse? You've all heard of the story of the 300 Spartans of Thermopylae, I'm guessing, yes? Perhaps from Herodotus, or perhaps better from Gerard Butler and those terrific abs on the movie screen. What were the Spartans of Thermopylae fighting for? Just out of curiosity. And by the way, if you think about what the Spartans of Thermopylae are fighting for, think of people in Egypt and Libya and Syria. The Spartans of Thermopylae, yes, they're 300 men. They have 7,000 other Greeks with them, but they're against, Herodotus would say a rather large number. Let's just say, give or take, conservative number, around 300,000 Persians. That's an enormous force, obviously. This disparity of numbers is nothing to sort of scoff at. You know that you can fight very hard. Obviously, you can yell, this is Sparta, all you want, and bare those teeth. At the same time, at the end of the day, you know that as well as you fight, as great, as formidable as your metal is, that's an imposing force you're fighting. So why make a stand and fight here? Explain. Good point. Good point. One of the great ironies, of course, when I teach Thermopylae at the Academy in San Francisco, that I often bring up is when you think about it, what's odd about the situation of these Spartans fighting and dying at Thermopylae is that in comparison to other Greek city-states, Sparta as a polis, yes, in comparison to other Greek city-states, is the least free of all Greek city-states. The irony being, it takes the least free to actually ultimately make the stand for freedom. It's not the Athenians with their lofty rhetoric and great philosophy making that stand there. The Athenians, frankly, would have fought for about 7 hours and said, we're too clever. We have to save our minds. We're getting out of here. Our democracy is too precious. We write too many cool plays. We're getting out of here, we'll fight tomorrow. For the Spartans, of course, you have a very different mindset. There is no tomorrow in that situation. Spartans are standing for the civilization. People in the Middle East are wanting a new civilization. Something I often ask kids at the academy in San Francisco also is, when you look at a situation like Sparta, or as we're about to read a little bit later on, the Melians, in the Melian dialogue in Thucydides, what is it in the culture we inhabit that is worth defending? In civilizations, in cultures in which fear is the dominant factor, it is very, very easy to spot malevolence, to point the finger and find, not to be biblical necessarily, evil. But in societies in which freedom predominates, for the most part, it is often difficult to fight this thing because it is difficult to find it. What is the thing being fought for in this civilization? I'm not harking to some great new video game where the North Koreans invade us. Not necessarily. Although I haven't yet played that. It might be kind of cool. What is it in a free society that is worth defending? Please? Right. There is no determination, at least individual autonomous determination in that society. Therefore, we want a state to grant us this. In our state, in our civilization, what are the things worth defending? Tolkien, of course, would have many answers to this. Yes, good point, yes?
Well, perhaps if you're in a society where freedom-oriented age is trying to preserve the status quo.
And what is the status quo? The status quo is not something we yell out with a beard and great abs, yes? For the status quo, rather it's for Sparta. Very good. So we fight to defend the way things are, in that sense. Okay, all right. How do we understand the idea of freedom and liberty? What do you guys, you're entering this week-long seminar, what do you understand it to be? We're talking 2011 understanding, obviously. We'll go to the Greek understanding in a second, yes?
To be left alone.
In order to? We're not saying to be left alone, i.e. enclose ourselves in a cocoon like Nietzsche would have it, and basically not have any contact with the outside world, yes? What sense left alone?
Not be told what to do by the government.
Okay, so to have that sort of being able to determine what you'd want in your life, bereft of the state telling you what to do. Here's what the Greeks would say regarding freedom. You're going to read a little bit of Plato later, of course, and his teacher Socrates. The Greeks understood freedom as having two separate levels. In order to understand it, you sort of have to go through the first before you get to the meatier section of what the concept means. The first level is, or uses, what we in English call, in a preposition, freedom from. Well, I'll put a ... who knows. Basic understanding of freedom, freedom from, i.e., when we have control lifted over our shoulders, we are no longer living at home, you're off to college, mom and dad are no longer telling you what to eat, and more importantly, what or what not to drink. You're off doing what you want by yourselves. You are free from parental control to a certain extent, societal control in the town in which you lived or city in which you lived. You have the ability to make your call, your own call of what you want to do. But if we only dwell with freedom from, we realize that rather quickly, we have a plethora of choices to choose from. But quickly, if we're kind of mature about it, we realize that not all choices have the same value. Freedom from essentially places a really big menu on your plate or at your table setting. That big menu is enormous. It's like going to the Cheesecake Factory and seeing that really huge menu. But unlike the Cheesecake Factory, the choices that we have when we have freedom from don't have symbols like a little heart, safety, cholesterol-free symbol, or a spicy symbol. Basically, they're symbol-less. You make your call. You flip the coin. But the catch is that not all choices have the same value or are better or worse for you. There's often a misconception I run into with art students in San Francisco who say, well, freedom is a virtue in so many ways, because once you have freedom from, nobody's telling you what to do, yes? Of course, this is a very sort of a Bay Area, San Francisco way of looking at things. Once I am free from authority telling me what to choose and what not to choose, I can choose anything, and by definition, since I'm making the choice, it's good. I will then say, okay, how about you and me, this person in my classroom in San Francisco, let's go over to 6th Street in the city, and let's purchase some shiny white rocks in the street. Let's put you in a hotel, and you can do this all weekend if you'd like. You're free to do this, by the way. Oh, the cops might say no. But in the end, at the end of the 2 days of doing this, plus or minus for you? Well, it goes without saying, yes? Rhetorical question. Not all choices are going to be good completely or bad completely for you. The Greeks would say, if we only dwell with freedom from, we don't realize that if you delve a little bit deeper, excuse me, if you delve a little bit deeper, another preposition, you have freedom to. Freedom to means you're looking at your own menu, and you are able somehow, you have some capacity to make the choices with some competency and say, these are choices that are better than others. You can evaluate some as more pluses than minuses. The Greeks would say, the citizen of the polis who thinks, because I am free from my parents, my elders, whatnot, because I'm free from them, I am going to drink an amphora, a clay jug of wine a day. Because I'm free, right? It's a good decision. My students in San Francisco would say the same thing. As long as it's my decision, it's a good decision. The Greeks would say, go ahead. Knock yourself out. Nobody's going to stop you. You're free. You're a free citizen living in Athens. But should you drink that amphora of wine a day, you will quickly realize that you cannot get by a day in a few months without that amphora of wine. And then the Greeks would say something very strange would happen. It's another Greek concept, of course, concept called irony. And the irony, of course, is that the person who considered themselves free, who indulged in the amphora of wine a day, who can no longer function without the amphora of wine a day, and function not very well, that being the case, is not free at all. In fact, the person who cannot get by a day without the amphora of wine is the very opposite of a free person. A person is a slave. A slave, in the most ironic and bitter sense, who doesn't wait for the tyrant to shackle him, but who rather puts the shackles on himself. In the Greek mind, the most pathetic, the worst form of slave. Slavish, by the way, very Greek adjective, i.e. someone who almost runs away from freedom. The discussion revolves around a central question. As if you've read Platonic dialogue, yes, there's always a central question associated with each one. If you read the Meno, the question there is, what is virtue? How can we discover what virtue is? In the very oddly named symposium, anybody know what a symposium means? English definition? When you go to a symposium, what does that usually mean? Usually a place where you see a lot of people sort of dress up like I am right now, hanging out with each other, giving speeches, talks, that kind of thing. A classical meaning of symposium, a drinking party, where you're laying down, drinking a lot of wine and just talking. The symposium of Plato, of course, main question there, what is love? In the Republic of Plato, perhaps the most famous, arguably the most important of the dialogues, central question, what is justice? What is it to be a just individual? What is it to be a just city? We can sort of put that in the back burner for a second. We'll get back to it maybe a little bit later. Glaucon, the young man from Athens, is telling Socrates, there really is no such thing as justice. You've just read his little sort of explanation for it. There really is no such thing as justice because justice is avoided, if possible, by the person who is seeking to either do or not do it. Before we get to the central questions, our central questions on the reading, what is happening in the story? Somebody give you a quick synopsis. Yes?
So basically a man gets access to the guidance ring after an earthquake. And
Okay,
yeah, it makes him invisible.
good.
He can do anything that he wants. And what Glaucon was trying to make
Uh-huh.
is that since he can do whatever
Good point. Let's backtrack a little bit. The farmer who finds the cachet with the ring, what does he actually find? When there's an earthquake, what does he see first? What was that? Really big horse, yes? Dead body inside. Is the dead body a small body, average size body? It's a big one. It's a very large one, larger than human size. Again, metaphor there. We'll get to that later. This body has a ring, which Gyges, the Lydian shepherd, discovers. If he puts it on and turns the bezel a certain way, he becomes invisible. He knows it. He notices this while he's hanging out with his friends, yes, his fellow shepherds. Most basic question. When Gyges finds out this ring turns him invisible, and if you probably figured out by now, Professor Tolkien knew his fair share of Plato, hence his own ring. Why is it that Gyges' first action, or first actions, after he discovers his invisibility, is to A, seduce the queen, B, kill the king? Simple answer, of course, would be if you're Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. But why would he do this? Explain. Explain.
Human nature, trying to get to the possible here.
Well, that's what we're you guys in college for. Go ahead.
And if humans, in our nature, we have the power to do something, it's good. We like power. We like to be in charge. We like to go.
Good point, but good point. But the funny thing about the ring of Gyges, yes, is that unlike Professor Tolkien's ring, which if you've read the ring stories of Tolkien, a person who wears the ring, Frodo or whomever, not only becomes invisible, but you also gain this like oomph in mojo, i.e. you can convince people through the strength of your will to do something. For all that we know from Plato, that doesn't happen with Gyges' ring. All you get is invisibility. It's not as if you put on the ring and today I'm benching 240, I'm benching 300 tomorrow. No. You're pretty much the same person, you're just invisible. So how does this lead to power? It's a good point though. Yes? Explain.
Well, they talk a lot about, like, when he's invisible, it's when they're talking about him like he's not there.
Right.
Like that. And, I mean, and at the end it says, like, that the onlookers would think he's an idiot if he didn't do this when he was invisible, but to his face they would say that it was unjust. You know what I mean?
How again? They would call him...
Because they don't know what he's doing.
Right.
But if he was doing it with everyone watching, they would reprimand him for it.
Oh, I see. I got it. Good point. Yep.
Well, it doesn't need to be invisible to commit just acts. I mean, the ring only enables him to commit unjust acts because he can't.
Can we not do or perform a just act with the ring?
You could, but I don't think it's necessary.
If I see an old lady struggling to get across the street, I put on the ring, I become invisible. I become this immovable hand helping the old lady across the street. I can do good things with the ring, yes?
Yes, but you don't need to go on ring to help her. You can do it without the ring.
Okay, point, yes.
The issue of power is that it doesn't lead to power, it unleashes your power. Because the moral of the story is that people are innately selfish, and they really don't care about each other. There really is no such thing as justice. The moral of the story is that only as a society are you ever just. And the ring demonstrates that if you're invisible, you really don't give a damn
What power is being unleashed, as you say?
within yourself.
From Glaucon, where is the power? From Gyges, who puts on the ring and becomes invisible. Has any of his potency, not to bring in Aquinas, has any of his strength or potency increased? So what's being unleashed?
It is your innate self.
His true self. Okay, interesting. Yes?
It takes away the influence of other people in a way because you no longer have to respond to other people's reactions to him
Right.
or something. So he kind of elevated to the point where he can do something like on his own for the self-interest. He kind of raised to a pedestal or condition
I see. Good point. Good point. Yes?
Using the power to do injustice to others, which in Plato's hierarchy is better than justice, which is what you would do because it's preferable undergoing injustice.
How do we know what he's doing would be unjust once he puts on the ring? Good point. Okay. Yes.
I think I'm going to disagree with what a lot of people are saying. They're
Sure.
saying that like they're unleashing his natural like power and natural self. But I completely disagree. It's not natural for someone to be completely removed from interaction with other beings. We're a social animal, and our social interactions are innate to who we are, how we work. So I don't think we would say that his complete ability to act selfishly without any kind of reaction from society is natural. I think that it's taking man and removing his natural interactions with society and then seeing what would happen in that case.
So if I'm following, the ring does not unleash what Gyges truly is, but rather corrupts what truly is there to begin with.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yes.
And I think, going back to what you said before, you could commit just acts with the ring, but we want recognition for the good things that we do. But we also want that freedom from
Right.
punishment. We don't want to get caught. And I think Glaucon's making the point that because he can't get caught when he's invisible, he's doing all these acts because of that sort of I can do no wrong. No one's there to see me and no one's there to punish me.
Right. Your earlier point that we want recognition for the acts that we do. Does it affect the virtue, not to go too much on a tangent, but does it affect the virtue or justice of an act that we consider good if we know we are going to directly benefit from it?
I think it does.
The Boy Scout who's going to help the lady across the street, yes? He helps her and he says, here you are, ma'am. I've helped you. I'm going back now. Hopefully you won't get hit by a car. Case A. Case B, he walks the old lady across the street because he knows that her husband is waiting across the street who's going to give him $50. Does it affect the virtue or the justice of the act?
I think, I mean, regardless of if there's like a monetary reward, there's a social reward, or there's like an internal reward.
Define those two things, very profound things, but define them.
Okay, so a social reward would be, there's no money, but people see you, and whether or not they come up to you and actually congratulate you, you know that they saw you do this good thing.
Right.
They couldn't possibly be thinking anything bad about you for doing that. And then there's more of like an internal reward where, I mean, innately within us, you know, I believe that we have a desire to help people, you know, and so when we do something like that, it makes us feel good inside, right? So I think it'd be hard to say that there's no virtue. I mean, then you'd be saying that there's no virtue in any act because
Right.
we're always rewarded either internally or externally for anything we do.
Is the internal or social more valuable than the material?
I think it depends on the person.
Okay, point. Yes, hand up early.
You said it mostly as just basically what I was going to say was you can boil anything down to self-interest. So he doesn't commit unjust acts when he's not wearing the ring because committing just acts will make him look good socially and therefore better himself. But when he puts on the ring, he has no need to look good socially because no one knows he's there. So
Uh-huh.
he needs it. It's not in his self-interest anymore.
Good point, but I'm sort of getting the impression now that a just act would be something we do that a majority or a consensus would deem just. Is that the case? Is an act just because a lot of people, at least more than one, say bravo to you, kudos, street cred, whatever you want, for whatever you did? Does that make it just? Hand up early. No? How come?
Because justice is, I believe it's universal concept, and it's irrelevant to what majority views are. What is just is always just, regardless of how others see it. But if you push me on why it's universal, that then we get it.
I'm not going to push you on why it's universal. I may nudge you on what tells you it is just if it's not consensus.
The way I answer that is how I was raised. It's what
Sure.
my parents taught me.
Your background and being able to judge better or worse. Okay. Plato would open the door, obviously, for us who read this account to ask ourselves the question, if we had the ring Again, I'm not talking Tolkien's ring where we end up like Gollum now. If we had this ring of Gyges, what would we not do? What would we do is very open to interpretation, yes? But the real most telling question is, what would you hold yourself back from doing? If you knew, nobody could see you. 1, 2, yes?
Whatever your conscience restrains you from doing.
I would do the things that my conscience tells me don't do. With the ring?
Anything that your conscience, I would do anything other than the things that my conscience doesn't allow me to do. Kind of holds me back.
Right. Okay, fine. I'll go with that. Go ahead. Yes?
I would not act like I usually do on like a normal basis. I wouldn't be doing what everybody else is doing. I would be kind of like doing things that I would completely change my perspective or that I was
Right.
curious about.
Because you knew that nobody's going to see you doing it anyway, so.
Like, if I was in a school, for example, and I walk around and like kind of look at people and go to the door to like kind of, you know,
I could lend you a pen. Right. Very cool. Okay, got it. Yes? So, so properties up to debate. Like we can like a, we get. Okay. Good point. Yes.
I won't do anything that I've already determined to be immoral. Like, I don't know if this is a good example, but like right now, I deem like crazy, pornography to be immoral, and I have the ability to do it now. I just believe my history, no one will do it. Just like being invisible, but I don't do it because it's immoral. And it's the same
Right.
thing. Once I know it's bad, I'm not going to do it just because I can get away with it. If I have a sort of moral hierarchy within me, that's going to prevent me from making those choices.
I gotcha. Okay. Yes, please.
I think the problem is that a lot of our conscience is conditioned by society. So the longer you wear the ring, the more that conscience is going to break down and the more kind of unspeakable acts you will commit. So I mean, the first time you put it on, you might do something simple like stealing, an apple from the market. The longer you're removed from society, the more kind of paralyzed you might become from it.
Interesting. Would they still be terrible acts?
No, I don't think they would.
How come?
Well, because if you don't have a conception of justice and the ability to commit acts of justice in absence of society, then you can't commit injustice.
Good point, but that would mean that the ring makes us less intelligent than we were before. Because we can't see of justice anymore.
Have like a kind of conception of intelligence, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. You could still be kind of under a false impression of what justice is.
Okay, got it. Yes, 1, 2. Go ahead.
It seems to me that the rings, the problem with this is that the ring provides the farmer with this unlimited freedom against the freedoms of anybody else.
How is it unlimited freedom?
Because he doesn't have to worry about the freedoms of others, so he has complete control over not only himself, but everybody else as well.
Okay, all right.
And what that eventually causes is he essentially becomes enslaved by his own power, by his own freedom.
How so?
In essence, he can't stop himself after he has that complete freedom. As soon as he starts, for instance, in the anecdote of the wine, he can keep drinking wine all he wants, but at some point he becomes addicted to it. And he can't stop drinking the wine. And then he becomes enslaved to it. The same thing happens here.
Point. Okay, very good point. Yes.
I think to kind of jump on what he said is, in Northwest and justice, our definition of justice has to do with intelligence, but has to do with what society constructs as justice. And the farther you remove from society, the less you associate yourself with those rules. It's like, to put it in almost a figurative sense, if I'm part of a village and I follow those rules that this village has conditioned me, and then I leave into the jungle, the longer I'm away from that village, the longer I'm going to, or the more I'm going to disassociate myself with their definition of justice.
Good point. If I could ask a very humble question, which bugs all of my sociologist friends. What is society? In my philosophy class, by the way, it's the dirty S word. If you say it, minus half a point. All right, well, what does it mean? Anybody seen the video, since you guys are in this conference, Keynes versus Hayek, round 2? What does Hayek say about the economy towards later on in the rap song? Is it a thing that can be fixed? There's no it at all. There's no thing. Why? Because it's all of you. It's parallel thought. What is society? Bugs my sociologist friends to no end when I ask this question. Go ahead.
I guess the association of people in a community generally governed by certain mores, so that the community finds acceptable.
So if
Or
you,
each member of the community finds acceptable.
so if you had a group of people who were not governed by a set of mores, you would not have society.
No, they would just say that they don't, well, I think that to say that there are no, they don't judge something to be morally wrong is itself a moral statement.
Slow down again. Wait, they don't judge something to be.
If they say that there is nothing that is morally wrong, everything is acceptable,
Right.
I think that is itself a moral statement.
Interesting. So they can't escape making a moral statement in that sense.
Sure.
Okay. Yep.
I think it's the spontaneous or kind of customs of individuals and interactions between them.
Would be society. Does society then grant justice its standing? That, of course, would mean we all got together today, took a straw poll, and said, okay, justice is a purple cat, or whatever we want to call it. Is that where justice comes from? Consensus. You can get a lot of things from consensus. Justice, beauty, a little tough one, that one. Virtue, a little bit tougher. With regards to virtue, what if I had the ring and had it in my heart the desire not to do injustice, but to do justice? The unspoken argument Glaucon is telling Socrates is, even the most moral person, given this ring, will eventually go from saint to monster. Why? In fact, the most moral person who has the ring has the greatest capacity to become a monster than the immoral person. Why? Because the saint would want to use this ability to do good. I hate wars. They're horrible. Therefore, I want to end wars. So how do I do this? Well, since I'm invisible, I can grant other people this gift of mine. And we'll go around the world just kill a whole bunch of people. Those who would start wars. It's for the greater good. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that phrase in college. Anyway, that ominous, the greater good phrase. I want to do good things. Is it true that the Ring of Gyges would do this? You can't do anything virtuous ultimately with it. In Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo offers the ring to his friend Gandalf. And Gandalf says, I can't take it. It would be worse if I took it. Why? I'm the most powerful being in the stage right now. If I took it, I would use it to do good. And the end result would be far more horrible than what you could ever achieve as a hobbit. How come? What the ring grants Gyges, yes, ultimately, is that. Gyges thinks it's power. He thinks. But ultimately, what he's pointing to is freedom from, the ultimate sense of freedom from. Nothing, absolutely nothing holding you back, because they can't see you. No accountability, no responsibility. But ultimately, second question, is Gyges free? I'll be completely honest with you guys. You're a really nice bunch of people. From the answers you've given me, the things you'd hold yourself back if you had the ring. Your moral standards, your conscience, I admire all of you already. Gotta be honest with you. If I had the ring, a whole bunch of grudges I had when I was a kid. Kids who pushed you around in grade school, well, who knows? All gloves are off at this point, because there are no gloves. You can't see them. What would you not do? But a person who is not restrained at all, as Gyges is, the ultimate sense of freedom from, can he call himself free? Does that person possess liberty?
I would say no, and the second is true too. Because as Ruth was pointing out, it's not even that he can't restrain himself from his desires. He doesn't want to. Because he can't have anything he wants. There's nothing stopping him, essentially. So, what would that?
If you can have anything you want with nothing stopping you, wouldn't that be good? for the person who can have anything he or she wants.
In a purely materialistic sense, sure it would be good for him. Well, I mean, assuming they don't hurt themselves.
Right, assuming they'll end up in rehab. Okay, I gotcha. Okay, go ahead.
I think the form of freedom is like anything else. Like if you have everything, it's worth nothing. So I mean, if you have absolute freedom, you don't value it because there's nothing really to kind of go after.
A combination of Chesterton and Aristotle, what you're talking about right now. Nice use of paradox. So if we have everything, it's worth nothing. How come? Everything is pretty cool. It's a very large bank account. We don't usually chase, yes, the things that Guy Gyes chases, yes? The first actions he does. Go after the queen, she's probably pretty good looking. Kill the king, because he's competition. We probably don't chase after these things because we consider them unpleasant. In fact, we consider them quite pleasant. So how are they bad? Aren't they good? When you go to a restaurant and you ask the sommelier, I'd like a really good bottle of wine. You're probably not going to ask that sommelier, please give me the one that tastes like vinegar. No. You want the really nice one, a really buttery taste, a beautiful aroma. You want that one. You chase things that you consider pleasurable, that are good. But how in this sense would that be not good? Guy Gyes isn't saying, I put on this ring, I turn invisible, and I'm going to go to the nearest dump. I'm going to wallow around in filth. He's not. He's saying, I'm going straight to the palace. That's where the action is. Silk sheets, lots of wine, I can do whatever I want. So how then do we call this not good?
Well, again, it depends on a large degree of our definition of good. If we're talking about, like I said, from a materialistic sense, absolutely, it's good, it's pleasurable. But it also, if we were to say that it's good, would be to say that that's the only thing that's valuable. Because Guy Gyes, at this point, it seems like it would be almost impossible for him to exist as he before in society. If people knew that he possessed the ring, interactions with any other person would be almost impossible because they'd have to act in such a way that they knew that he could get back at them if
Right.
they said anything negative about him. If they had any sort of positive relationship with him, one would seem that it would be almost largely based on the material sense that he has and
Right.
the ability to offer them anything that they want.
Right.
Which means that he loses a significant portion of the value of human society in terms of community and those things. Moreover, by setting himself up as God, he loses, in terms of any philosophic sense, the idea of good, the pursuit of anything other than his self-interest.
Which modern philosophers, Nietzsche et al., would say that's basically the same thing for a person who sets himself as God, yes? I get to decide what is good. When you say it is impossible for him to live with others, here's the double irony with freedom. Guy Gyes doesn't bother to consider freedom too. He only focuses on freedom from. But ultimately, what he is free from is communion with others, community with others, because he can't. He's in a way divorced from everybody else. If you've read Tolkien again, anybody know what happens to those 9 kings of men who are given the rings by Sauron, what they turn into? They're pretty nasty beings. Go ahead. Ring wraiths, yes? Also called the Nazgul by Tolkien. The word wraith, Tolkien, of course, was professor of Anglo-Saxon English, is very similar to the root word for... What do we do when we writhe? When do we writhe? In your pain. You sort of, you contort, your muscles spasm. When the ring wraiths of Tolkien are unmasked, what do they look like? If you don't have the ring, you can't see like the inner, the whole Frodo vision thing. But if you take their armor away, what do they look like? Nothing. They're invisible. Tolkien knew his Plato very well. Ultimately, Guy Gyes' invisibility is a metaphor. He's not only divorced from others, in a sense, he's divorced from himself. He can't say no anymore. In that sense, he's a slave to himself. But you have to ask Gyges, if we could sit him down on the table, or maybe more appropriately a couch, why did you do this? What were you seeking?
It was his own self-interest, basically. Like it's greedy people by nature. And it's always an eye for an eye.
Explain the always eye for an eye thing.
Well, it's like the whole relative thing here. Like, oh, back in Netherlands was the person who got let down in high school, and
Right.
I'll do it back to you.
Right. Good point. When we talk of the self-interest that Gyges is involved with, yes, this is self-interest that does not benefit others. What direction of the bezel of the ring does it get turned for the invisibility to kick in? How does he turn it in order to become invisible? There you go. Inward. If it's turned inward, that means the bezel is pointing to Gyges. The key to Gyges, and what causes the great divorce, not to bring in Lewis, is essentially his saying, all that matters is me. And Socrates is listening to Glaucon, not even saying anything. And he's saying, you're kind of making my argument for me. He can't be just. He can't be free. Why? Because he believes power is the provider of virtue. Power is not the provider of virtue. Rather, power is the pretender to virtue. We'll see this later on when we get to Thucydides. Thanks for being here right now. If you have any questions at all on the Plato reading, I'm here to answer those. Good job, guys. Thanks. Sure. Any questions at all? Please.
Why, like, I was wondering more if it had
Sure.
if it had a meaning that the guy he found the ring with
Right.
or was dead. Like,
Good point.
I would be more interested in why did he die and why did he die?
Good point. Plato and Socrates do not answer why this being dies, who had the ring previously. But his being buried with the horse is a sign of some sort of royalty, some sort of sense that he was more than the average person. He's bigger than the average person, meaning he perhaps had more power than the average person who may later on find this ring. But the point that he ultimately dies and ends up in a crevice is Plato very subtly saying, we often think that power will give us the ultimate kind of freedom. I'm not even talking this kind of freedom, the freedom of Gyges. We seek power because we think we're going to be free. We think we'll be free from people telling us not to do what we choose to do. But ultimately, power, if you sort of follow the footsteps or follow the crumbs, traces back to our greatest fear as people, as human beings. And that is, we know we're going to die. We know we're mortal. As powerful as we are blood, bone, and gristle. And in that sense, power sometimes, temporarily, gives us the illusion that we're more than what we are. That's our ultimate stake of freedom. I want to be free from, essentially, death. Why I want to be powerful? Because I can stave off death as much as I can. Why I go to the gym, inject myself in Botox, steroids, whatever. I want to be young forever, powerful forever. Because in the back of my head, I have this primordial fear of nothingness. We know we're something. Folks familiar with a guy called the Venerable Bede, English saint, B-E-D-E. In Spanish, we call him San Beda. Bede was a missionary in Britain many years ago, right after Roman times. And he wrote that the ancient Anglo-Saxons believed, the people who Tolkien wrote about, believed that life was like a sparrow flying into a mead hole out of a cold winter night. Simply flying into a mead hole, he comes from nothing, i.e. cold winter bleakness on the outside. He has warmth for a second as he flies through this hole. That's life. And ultimately, this is the old pagan Anglo-Saxon view, the sparrow flies out of that mead hole. Or Christian infusion in Britain, i.e. the belief that life is this really cool thing. But then there's nothing. To the Greeks, of course, there's Hades. If you're really special, you end up in the Elysian fields. But if you're not, you end up in Hades where you see Achilles and Odysseus, and you see them, they're just shadows. The only sense they have is smell. Whether they're good or bad, it doesn't matter. You all end up in Hades with a potentially bleak afterlife. It's very scary. And there's no pearly gates. There's no strumming the harp with angels in heaven. The ancient Greeks believed you died, and that was pretty much it. What makes Plato unique, or what makes Beowulf unique, if you've read Anglo-Saxon poetry, of course, is that people who believed that there wasn't a rewarding afterlife still try to do good things, which I think is extremely difficult. Knowing that ultimately you will not be rewarded for this, but you still strive towards justice in this temporary life in which you live, it's quite unique. But to address your question, my point is that you're seeking this sort of ultimate freedom through power. That power and strength, kratos, the Greeks would say, force, gives you the illusion that you're more. That you can somehow stave off death. It's a great fear. Thank you for the question. Great one. Anybody else? Please.
Yeah, you just repeated again. You said that power gives us the illusion that we're more than what we are. Mm-hmm. Could we also call that pride? And the question is also, do you believe that as human beings we can be powerful and at the same time be humble?
To answer your second question, yes. But I'll get to that in a second. The first part of the question I think is interesting. Pride, I don't think you necessarily have to be powerful to be prideful. Not necessarily. Sometimes it does lead to it. Folks familiar with an author called John Milton, English poet, wrote Paradise Lost? Know Milton's Paradise Lost a little bit? Why does Lucifer do what he does? That begins, of course, the sad chain of events in Paradise Lost. Anybody read it? Read Milton? Milton's Paradise Lost talks about before human creation, you had God the Father, you had God the Son. It doesn't mention Jesus necessarily, it says God the Son. And you have the heavenly host, this innumerable mass of heavenly beings. Milton says, among the heavenly hosts, there are different varieties, different sort of hierarchies of these angels. The highest hierarchy of angels are what we call seraphim. Seraphim are special because they simply sing God's name for eternity. That's all they do. They sort of sing with a beautiful voice. Chief of these seraphim is an angel called Lucifer. Lucifer, anybody here speak Spanish? In Spanish, when we ask someone, ¿Dónde está la luz? What are we asking for? Luz in Spanish from Latin, lux, L-U-X, light, yes? Lucifer is so named because he is the brightest of all the angels. He's the morning star. He's the commander of the heavenly host. But he notices one day, at least Milton will tell us, that one day God the Father will create this new being in his own image, this new being called man and woman. He puts him on the side, puts him on his right side. He then says to the heavenly host, you guys, you've been with me from the beginning, but I'm going to put you guys on my left side. It's just my call. It's just me. I want to do it. I'm going to put you guys over here. Lucifer, seeing this, is the first of the heavenly host to say, time out, boss. I am beautiful. That's a hairless ape you've just made. I am so much more glorious than that thing over there. Why am I on the left? I question what you just did. Ultimately, I will disobey what you just did. Famous line, of course, from Paradise Lost is Lucifer will say, "'Tis better to rule in hell than serve in heaven." Central to pride is the knowledge that there is some sort of order, that there is some sort of justice. Central to pride is the basic human desire, thrust, call it whatever you want, to say, I am not satisfied with that order, because that order, whatever is, what the Greeks will call what is, should be authored by me. Nietzsche will say the same thing, basically, i.e., the Superman in society, very few, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Hitler, whomever. These men realize they are superior, and they realize that to the superior man goes the ability not only to sway people, but to do something more special, to make morality his. Pride is the refusal to follow, essentially, some sort of existent order. Now, power helps pride, obviously, because If Napoleon is not a good soldier, if Hitler is not a good speaker, all their pride's not going to get them anything. But ultimately, pride can be achieved, I think, with a smidgen of power. It's not one causes the other necessarily. But you can be quite forceful and quite powerful without pride. The challenge, though, becomes keeping the humility. Because ultimately, you figure out you're better than everybody else. You're more talented, smarter than anybody else. So how do you rein in yourself? The Greeks will say, you can tell a civilized people with how they deal with freedom, i.e., the controls to freedom, what the Greeks will call limits to freedom, have to come from the individual. If the controls to freedom merely come from the outside, all you're doing is listening to the state telling you what they want. But if you're able to say to yourself, it's that old saying, yes, something we all learned this in college, the best line we learn in college when we go to a keg party. And that best line is, I've had enough. That's my 16th shot of Absolute. Long story, many years ago. Okay, that's it. That's all I'm taking. That's my last keg on Thursday night, whatever. The ability to do it by yourself, the Greeks would say, is at least the first step with freedom. Great question on pride, though. Thank you. Any other questions, you guys? Please.
What do you believe is justice, and where does it come from?
Oh, boy. We started an economics class, we have a philosophy class. Justice, if you boil it down, perhaps Plato would agree with me, and I'd be flattered if he did. Justice is people getting what is their due. You get what you deserve. You do things that are harmful. I'm not even going to bring in karma or anything, but you feel the effects of the harmful thing. You do beneficial things. Somehow you, at the same time, you're not waiting for heaven necessarily, but you achieve in yourself the beneficial thing. What makes justice difficult, you guys heard of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Really good friend of mine, Jim Scholl, is a priest, Jesuit priest, who teaches at Georgetown. He's in his 80s, very tall, very gaunt. When I met him for dinner many years ago in Georgetown, we were eating at Morton's Steakhouse. If you guys have been to Georgetown, it's like cobblestone streets, gaslit lamps. I was waiting on the street corner as he was coming in. Jim Scholl was coming in, and he was wearing his long coat and his hat. And it's, of course, dark, and it's foggy. And I think to myself, I hope I'm not about to be exercised at this moment by my friend. It's not John Peter Blatty's book, but he would always say over discussions, whether it's over prime rib or on the phone, we have to be careful with justice, because justice is a virtue, and I would agree, sure it is. But justice is one of the four pagan virtues. But justice as a virtue is the most terrible virtue, is the most fearsome virtue, the most unforgiving virtue. Something perhaps closer to you guys, memory in high school, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. Read the story, yes? Who is sort of the bad guy in the story? Shylock does what? To be a bad guy.
He gives someone a loan and says, if you don't pay back in time, I'll take your flesh, a pound of your flesh.
Gives Antonio the loan, yes, and says, your payment is, if you don't pay me back, I'm going to cut it out of you. At the end of the play, we have this courtroom scene wherein Shylock is saying, time's up, Antonio didn't pay me back, his ships are not in, his merchant ships are not in yet, he can't pay me back, so I now will extract my payment. Frankly, Shylock is fully within legal bounds, i.e., it was a signed contract. Antonio fully thought his money would be coming in, his Visa card would clear, who knows, that he was able to wager a pound of his own flesh. Shylock gives a very long speech. It's a very interesting speech, by the way, in The Merchant of Venice, in which Shylock, as a Jew, says, look, myself and my people have been denied any profession, every profession in Europe for hundreds of years. The only one we have is what you consider usury, lending money for money back with interest. Isn't it just that this deal, as it's made, should be completed as it is written under the law? Can't I once in my life have justice? It's a very powerful speech, by the way. But right after, we have an equally powerful speech by a character called Portia. Portia, of course, is a female lawyer who says justice, yes, ought to be served. But there's a little thing called mercy. Now, mercy, as Portia says, is the gentle rain that droppeth from heaven. It is twice blessed. It is something that grants a gift to the giver and the receiver. Ultimately, when you hear the word mercy, whether it's Caesar being merciful on Cicero during the Roman Civil War, other examples, when you think of mercy, it's a really irrational thing. It doesn't have to happen. A conqueror in war can look at a defeated enemy and say, you know what? As the Athenians will, you'll read about a little bit later on, I'm going to kill all of your able-bodied men and sell your women and children into slavery because I won. Fully within the bounds of myself being the victor. I would expect none the less if you were the victor. But when you say, you know what, I could do this, but I'm not going to, you're kind of saying justice does not have to happen. Because although it's a virtue, it's a very cold and hard virtue. Now, was the second part of the question where we get it, or where does it come from? I could be Platonic about it and say that there's this world of forms, that somehow another world exists where abstract concepts like beauty, justice, virtue exist. I'm not going to go that route necessarily, but I'll do this. When you are waiting in summer, this is concert season, yes? And you've saved up all summer, you've done your job, you worked, your summer job, you've saved up that money, and you want to buy that choice ticket to Concord or Shoreline. Really cool concerts coming in. You do something, who knows? Maybe I'm too old guy. Anyway, some cool band nowadays, younger for you guys, is coming into play. And you're finally able to buy your tickets. You've lined up, you've waited for an hour, 2, 3 hours to buy that ticket. And just before you're finally able to get to that booth and say, here's my cash, I want that ticket, somebody comes zooming along with a top-down Mercedes, pops out, gets in front of you in line, buys those tickets, and zooms away. Is your natural reaction, my, that was a pleasant experience, please let's do that again? Or do you rather say, hell no, what the, I won't say it. I've said far worse in those situations. Why bring this up? When you feel anger, basic human emotion, anger is impossible to be felt without even the slightest subconscious, not to get Freudian, the slightest subconscious acknowledgement of justice. You're saying something's wrong. I'm mad. I should be the one, you get what you deserve. I waited here, I saved the money, I deserve the tickets. And somebody else got it before you could. You're saying to yourself indirectly, by your anger, and by the way, you don't think yourself into anger, it just happens. When you're angry, you're pointing to some justice. Because if justice did not exist, you just say, oh, let's just do that again. Please zoom up again, take my tickets, and I'll just go home. So if we can somehow pinpoint what causes our anger, and we can call that injustice, unfairness, yes? I'll give you a small example. I have a discussion on the New Deal. I had it like last week with my students in US history class, and I was talking about, well, what if we took a progressive concept like the progressive income tax and applied it in the classroom? And of course, my students were like, oh, how are you going to do it? I'm like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Some of you are really bright kids who I kind of give A's to all the time, or A minuses because I'm not a very big, easy A guy. But there are some of you who don't work that hard and are naturally not really into history. You get C's and D's, that kind of thing. Because I feel bad about the kids who get C's and D's, those of you who get the A's, next exam we're going to have, I'm going to deduct points from your exam, even if you score up in the 90s. And I'm going to give those points to the kids who got C's and D's. From the back of the room, my A students, you can see the grumbling, you can see the seething, and finally a rising volcano. One lady with the highest voice in the world said, that's B-U, anyway, to that effect. But I had to ask, why do you feel that way? Simple answer, because I work hard. And therefore, if you work hard, what? Then I deserve the A. Go ahead.
But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that certainly not all anger is prompted by a proper conception of justice.
Very much so. Anger can be caused by?
Well, even if, let's say, a person is being punished for something they did wrong, even if that decision is just, they're likely to be less than happy about it.
Sure. Someone who is angry when, going back to early Western Civ, in Hammurabi's code in Babylon, we punish people differently than Hammurabi did, yes? We don't chop off hands and that kind of thing. But Hammurabi punished adultery. We don't punish adultery today. But generally speaking, we don't go to parties and say, hi, this is my friend Larry, the adulterer. It's not the best introduction in a social setting. A person who's had adultery done to them, him or herself, is angry. Why? Angry sometimes to the point of doing something bad about it. How come?
Well, in that sense, in the case of adultery, it'd be because the other person in marriage contract in this relationship reneged on their end of the agreement, if you will.
We're not faithful to the end of the bargain,
Sure.
so to speak. Okay. So what other things can cause anger?
Any affront to what we see as our dignity or not getting what we want, even if we don't necessarily deserve it.
But that would be, if somebody affronted my dignity, I still would be citing a wrongness occurring.
Or what we see as a wrong.
Sure. But if I see the wrongness occurring, I'm acknowledging that there is some sort of standard that has been tilted.